My name is Gary Ackerman. I am the Acting Director of the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, which is START for short, and we're one of the research teams on the project, on the overall program. Our project is looking at the empirical assessment of domestic radicalization, and there are a number of sort of innovations that we're trying to achieve with this project. So there's basically a number of major gaps in our understanding of radicalization. There's many theories, there's a multitude of theories, everything from it's all internal, driven by the individual psychology, to it's all driven by these nefarious organizations that recruit perfectly normal people and essentially brainwash them. And there's everything in between. Those are the most extreme. The problem is that almost none of these theories has been really tested to a rigorous standard. Some of them have been tested through case studies, some of them through small samples, but none of them have really been tested, especially across ideologies. So the idea is that some of them have been tested fairly well for instance, with Al-Qaeda-inspired groups, but not against right-wing or left-wing or ecological or other types of extremists. So the first thing we looked at is, okay, so there's a lack of empirical data to test these, which is one of the reasons why they haven't been tested. Another big problem is that many current studies conflate radical beliefs with radical behaviors. So they sort of look at them together, and they look and what this does, and everybody understands that beliefs don't equal behaviors, but they sort of analyze them together, a little bit mixed up. And so therefore you can't really look at the interaction between them. Do beliefs really prompt radical behaviors? If you have radical beliefs, does it lead to radical behaviors? Do radical behaviors look for radical beliefs as a justification? I mean, these are all different possibilities, hypotheses that nobody's been able to really tease out because they don't really collect their data and make a very clear distinction between radical beliefs and radical behaviors. Radicalization is a process. It's a path that an individual goes on. Parts of it are social, part of a group, parts of it are individual and personal. But either way, it's always a process, whereas most research up until now has sort of treated you're either radical or you're not. You're extremist or you're not. Where we think the question would be is, how extremist are you? We're all extremists to some degree, but on a scale of 1 to 10, maybe at certain times in our lives we're all a 1 or a 2. And only when you get to 9 or 10 are you actually engaging in violence, and only when you get to 7 or 8 are you actually engaging in illegal behavior. But we have to think of it as part of the process. We have to understand that process. And most of the research that gets done only focuses on the very extreme part of that process, the end result. And we think that you need to look at the entire process. And to do that, you need to look at life histories. Look at how did people start from being, the cute little kid in kindergarten to the guy who's strapping a bomb to his body and going out and engaging in a terrorist attack. First of all, what we're going to do is collect cross-sectional data on 1,800 or roughly approximately 1,800 individuals. And we're going to look at across the ideological spectrum. So from radical Al-Qaeda-inspired radicals to right-wing extremists, ecological extremists, to anti-abortion folks, to if we can find Hindu and Buddhist extremists. We want to be completely open to any type of political ideological extremism. And we're going to collect as many as possible. Roughly half of them, these are all ones that have the only criteria is that they have to have been radicalized in the United States, and they have to have been indicted for a crime in the United States. So radicalized, indicted, or they have to have been killed in the commission of a criminal act. So then they obviously weren't indicted. So those are our sort of main criteria. Within those 1,800 from across the ideological spectrum, we want to do roughly half that actually engaged in violence or violence-linked behavior. The commission or preparation for violence, whereas the other half we want to do who engage in non-violent illegal behavior. So, for instance, supporting terrorism or helping an extremist group logistically, raising money for them, etc., etc. So we want to separate that, and that will allow us, in academic speak, to get variation in the dependent variable, to look at what's the difference, what differentiates those extremists who engage in non-violent activities and those extremists who engage in violent activities. At the moment, we're only looking at criminal activities, but we can at least get that differentiation there. What we're also going to do is select out of those 1,800 between 100 and 120 individuals to do detailed qualitative case studies on. And those will also be roughly split between non-violent criminals and violent criminals within that set, extremists, criminals. If you want to do good analysis on the case studies, we actually want to do in-depth case studies of tracing their life history. They're sort of it's a life course analysis in a criminological way, but we're also using process tracing and several other techniques. But once we've got these sort of life courses or life histories of these individuals, 100 to 120, if you separate out roughly half non-violent crime and half violent crime, you can also tease out the process areas, because the large sample data set can only, in a limited sense, get you the process of how they became radical. But the more in-depth case studies will be very much focused on what are the pathways towards radicalization. And we think that's a sufficient sample size to actually get some good empirical evidence. And once we've collected all this data and all these analyses, to answer these questions like, does the pathway to radicalization differ across ideologies? And if so, how? What is the real linkage between behavior and belief when it comes to radicals in the United States? And does that differ across ideologies? And then most importantly, sort of what are the indicators, and can we get early warning indicators that are fairly reliable and differential and diagnostic for future risk of radicalization? What we might find very specific configurations of life events, triggering events, demographic factors, et cetera, that together make an individual at more risk of radicalization. And basically, I just say that there's similar analysis being done with individuals, making them more at risk for being involved with gang activity or being involved in other types of crime. We want to look at that in terms of radicalization. Instead of just being a purely intellectual exercise, it has definite policy implications. First policy implication is that we might actually find clusters of factors that do provide some early warning. We're also, that might on an individual level provide early warning. We must find clusters that at a contextual or community level provide this community is more susceptible. We're also looking at things like, to what extent are important nodes, recruiters you might want to call them, but people, radicalizers who go out there and consciously radicalize other people, to what extent are they crucial or necessary in the radicalization process? Because if they are, then it becomes a matter of identifying and removing those people from a community, rather than trying to look at every individual in the community who might be susceptible to radicalization. If they're not necessary for radicalization, then you have to go to a different level. So those have very big policy implications. Another major implication is, where do we intervene and how do we intervene? If we do this longitudinal analysis and we might find points where there's a relatively low-cost interventions, just so that you have, with sort of gang violence, there's certain, they're starting earlier and earlier. They're saying in elementary school we can start originally, because that's a lower cost intervention, rather than when somebody's already involved in the criminal justice system when they're in high school, et cetera, you want to get. So there might be points where we can say it's better to intervene here than intervene there. But you won't know that until you've done this empirical data, because, or this empirical analysis. Because otherwise, some people will say it's better intervening when they're already in prison. Some people say it's better intervening when they're in, Head Start, at early childhood, and we don't know where or when or what to do. So now we're going to look at those intervention points. We also might look at intervention points on a more tactical, operational criminal justice point of view, is what intervention points, once a person has already gone down the path from non-violence, what would trigger them to go from a non-violent crime to a violent crime? Because we're looking at both of those. And that might be intervention points right there. You might be an intervention point where we can stop people from making that last leap from non-violent radicalism to violent radicalism. That might give us some clues about it. So intervention points, I think, is very important. I think also we're going to learn a lot about the impacts of various factors as I said, we might identify these risk factors, but one of the big debates in the whole radicalization area is to what extent is it contextual, in the sense of people growing up with traumatic experiences in an environment with low socioeconomic standards, feeling alienated from general American society. These are all hypotheses, and they all receive some support, versus to what extent is it an outsider coming in and capitalizing on these elements to actually recruit somebody. And once we can then make communities less susceptible and individuals less susceptible. At the same time, we can look at our resources might be best spent by targeting the recruiters who are actually trying to capitalize on certain conditions in a community. And that might be, it might identify which nodes in the network are most important to focus on from a criminal justice perspective. I think that one of the things, as I've said, is that there's a lot we don't know. We know a lot more now than we did 10 years ago. In fact, we know we've made a quantum leap in the last 10 years in understanding radicalization. But in one sense, we made a quantum leap, relatively speaking. Other sense, we're still taking baby steps because there's so much that we don't know. And I think it's very important that this larger research effort has been underway, and that the National Institute of Justice is working in this capacity, because only when you're armed with knowledge can you actually make the best decisions to deal with these issues. And I think that I'm and my entire organization is very happy and excited to be part of this effort.